Well, good morning. Welcome to the Bryant Report. I am Mike Bryant, and I'm coming out with a new series of videos on the Pauline Pusser murder investigation, and I'm going to be focusing primarily on the forensic evidence now. I know I've done right around 40 videos, and a lot of it is I put out the audio recordings from the TBI report. I've done videos on some of the folks involved in the uh, in the investigation. David Roush. Uh, I talked about Jim Moffitt. I've talked about Dennis Hathcock. Talked about different things. But some of the criticisms from the other folks, from the other story, if you will, and some of the folks in my comment section, they kind of accuse me of nitpicking and going through this voluminous report and just finding the little bitty irrelevant mistakes, and none of that matters, and it's all about the forensic evidence, the mountain of forensic evidence, if you will. So I figured, well, let's go ahead and talk about the forensic evidence. And now, pretty much what you're going to discover when you look into the TBI report and you do look at the forensic evidence that 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 they've offered is that the forensic evidence, that they do have is not focused on finding Pauline Pusser's killer. It seems to be focused on simply trying to disprove Buford Pusser's uh, version of events. And I guess the logic is that if they can shoot holes in his story of what happened, then that must mean that he's guilty of killing, unaliving his wife, if you will. And so, which is kind of odd. It's kind of an odd tack to take in an investigation. You know, uh, I'm sure you've all heard, stories and studies out there where they'll have some folks in a room, and then they'll have some people bust in real quick and run through the room and then run right back out. And then they'll ask the folks in the room to give a description of the people that they saw. And, studies show that a lot of times, if not every single time, you're going to get varying descriptions, and people that are right there witnessing it right in front of their eyes, they still get it wrong. The color of the clothes, the type of clothes, the shoes, uh, description of the individuals. You'll get many different descriptions within this room. Now, does that mean that would you accuse those folks of lying? I mean, I don't think nobody would. I mean, I myself have been part of those experiments. When I went through the Navy's Law Enforcement Academy, they did the same thing. We were sitting in a classroom, and they had some folks bust in and have an argument and then run out, and then we were asked to give a description, and I myself got things wrong. Now, does that mean that I'm lying or that anybody else in that room would be lying if they got things wrong? No, it just means that our memories are not always 100% perfect. And then you layer onto that somebody who's going through a traumatic event where they witness a loved one murdered right in front of them, and they themselves get shot, get injured, get stabbed, what have you. Your memory is gonna suppress certain things, or maybe it's adds something, or it just kind of skews your view of it. And I don't know that we would accuse victims of other traumatic crimes of being guilty or being liars because their memory is faulty. I mean, to say that somebody's lying, I mean, that's kind of suggests an intent. Just because somebody gets something wrong or misremembers something doesn't mean that there's something nefarious going on with them or that they're intentionally trying to lie. But that's what we got. That's what the TBI. That's the approach that they took with what they were doing with the forensic evidence, and that's not surprising when you consider how the TBI, how they went about reopening the case and the fact that they closely mirrored a lot of their theories, closely mirrored Mike Elam's book, The Other Story, about Buford Pusser. I know that he doesn't think that that's the case, but I mean, they pretty much pick up right where he left off in his book, and they consulted Mike Elam, and and Mike Elam introduced them to uh, certain witnesses, so-called witnesses, hearsay witnesses, and so it's not surprising to me that that's the approach that they took. But I just want to set the stage on that. That's my opinion, of course, based on what I've seen. There's a lot of mistakes with the forensic evidence that you're going to see. They don't, they kind of guesstimate on some things. They make up things. They don't use the right parameters. They don't use the right vehicles. So a lot of it doesn't make sense. But again, that's where all this was going, is they were just trying to try to shoot holes in Buford's version of events of what happened, thus implicating him in the murder. So I think this is going to be like a multi-part. I'm not going to do one gigantic long. I mean, there's a lot of information to go through, so I'm going to break this up into parts. And so this first part, we're going to talk about the bloodstain pattern analysis that they did. Now, they have some video clips, and I did a video on this once before, where they're out there and they have a folding table on the ground and some butcher paper and a sponge on a string, and they're shooting it with a 357 Magnum. And I will say that when I did that video, I was wrong. And I said from the beginning, if I get something wrong, I will come on video and admit what I was wrong about. And so what I was wrong about when I did that previous video is I was under the assumption that what they were doing was trying to show that Pauline was shot with the 357 in front of the car. And the only reason I think I was operating under that assumption was because that was what their own expert alleged, Dr. Michael Revelle. He's the expert. He's the only expert that they had that came up with the theory that Pauline was shot outside the vehicle and placed in the vehicle. And he based, and part of what he based his opinion on was the blood stains that were on the hood and the windshield. So it would make sense that that's what this recreation, that these video clips would show. I mean, that's what I would have assumed. But apparently, I was wrong on that. I was wrong. What they're really trying to show is that Buford, that the reason that there's the stains on the hood and the windshield was not that it was Pauline's blood, that it was Buford's blood, and that he was standing in front of the vehicle, shooting himself in the mouth with the 357, thus causing the blood to end up on the hood and the windshield. And that's kind of odd, considering that kind of goes against their own expert. Why would they go with that? You know, it doesn't. You're trying to prove your own expert wrong. It's kind of weird, but again, that's yet, you know, that's just a lot of a pattern of what's going on with this TBI report. There's a lot of little weird things like that. They don't seem to have their own. They don't know what happened. See, the bottom line in all this is the TBI doesn't know what happened to Pauline, and they lost all the physical evidence that there was. You know, the blood samples were lost. The car's not around anymore, obviously. Uh, I don't even, you know, the shell casings aren't around. We don't have a murder weapon. So what they're left with, the only way that they know the only way they can solve this case is through DNA evidence, which they don't have, a confession, which they don't have, you know, fingerprints, murder weapon, they don't have any of that. And so all they're left with is, well, if we can prove what Buford said was wrong, then that means he's guilty, and we can solve this cold case, and we can justify continuing on with our funding for solving these cold cases. I mean, remember, there's all kinds of unsolved cases, missing persons cases, uh, you know, SA kits that haven't been processed, but yet they're spending time and money and resources on trying to solve this cold case, which they know they can't solve. And at the end of the day, they admit they didn't really solve it because Mark Davidson himself said it's up for debate at the press conference. So there you have it. But let's go ahead and look at these. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to play these clips again for you guys, just so we can refresh our memories. And let me see if I can get to share my screen. And let's do this. And let's see here. Let's see if I can slide this camera over a little bit. And all right, so this is the blood stain pattern analysis test number 1. And as you can see right off the bat, what they've done is they put a table on the ground and they put some butcher paper on top. Now that's supposed to simulate the hood of the Plymouth Fury that Buford was driving that morning. And what they've done is they're simulating that is 30 inches off the ground, because apparently they went and measured a Plymouth Fury and found that it was 30 inches from the ground to the top of the hood. Now, interesting point about that is they did not measure a 1967 Plymouth Fury 1. They measured a 1966 Plymouth Fury 3. And as a matter of fact, I think I've got actually let me see if I can bring that up and see if I can show you a picture of that. Okay, where is? Well, I guess I didn't screenshot that, but it's in the report for sure. But that's what it is. And maybe the next video, I tell you what, when I do the next video at the beginning of that. Oh, actually, hold on a second here. Actually, I've got it. I do have it right here. Let me see if I can share the screen. Yeah, okay, here we go. Now, this was, let's see if we can, photos of vehicle measurements on 10/18/23. Ryan Shanklin obtained permission from Charles Carroll to photograph and measure a 1966 Plymouth Fury 3 that he owns. The purpose was to obtain measurements of the height of the hood from ground level. The vehicle's tires were flat as observed in the photographs. Uh, a photograph was obtained showing the tire sidewall from the tread to the rim to account for the additional length to add. Now, scroll down, and that's the Plymouth Fury 3, the 1966 Plymouth Fury 3. And as you can see, the tires were flat and kind of sunk into the ground. So then they measured uh, from the rim to the edge of the tire there. I guess that's what they added. But just so you can see, that is a 1966 Plymouth Fury 3. So they didn't even measure the right vehicle. Now you might say, well, what's the difference? Well, take a look at that. And then let me bring up the 67 Plymouth Fury. And let me get it going here. Screen share, window, boom, share. So that's the car. That's the car Buford was driving. So you can see it's definitely different. And of course, the tires on this car are inflated. It's sitting on a firmer surface. So it's just, yet again and again, the TBI does these curious things. Why would you measure, why would you use a car that's not the same car? It just doesn't make any sense. But and the thing of it is, and I'm going to bring up another picture here. Now this is a 1967 Plymouth Fury 1 that very similar to what Buford was driving. Now they had this car. They went and they got photos and drone shots of this car for their recreation. So why not? Why didn't they have them measure that car? It's just time and time again, the TBI would do these curious and strange things. But anyway, let me get back to the video, and let's not waste too much of your time. And let me go ahead and bring this back up. So yeah, let's start with the first clip. And let me go ahead and put this up here like that. Now, this again, like I was explaining, they got the tabletop on the ground and the butcher paper on top of it, and that's to simulate the hood of Buford's car, the 67 Plymouth Fury 1. And you can see they've got a couple tripods set up and a string in between, and hanging from the string is a bloody sponge, or a piece of a sponge, actually. And so what they did is they measured 48 inches, because Buford was 6'6", and if you add 30 inches to the 48 inches, that gives you the 6'6" measurement of Buford. And if you think about it, even that measurement would be off, because 6'6" would be the top of his head. Clearly, he didn't shoot him. If you're saying that he shot himself, he wasn't wounded in the top of his head. It was down here, his jaw. So, that's a little bit of a distance, maybe 4 or 5, maybe 6 inches down is what they should have had it. So they were even off on their own measurements. But anyway, let me go ahead and play this clip.
3, 2, 1.
All right, so that was the first clip. That was the first test. They did 3 tests. They shot 3 different times, because they were trying to replicate that pattern. or find out if their theory made sense. Which what they again, the whole point of it is to, if they can prove their theory right, then that makes Buford wrong, which means he's got to be guilty. All right, so now we'll show the second one. All right, let me pull this up. All right, and I appreciate you guys bearing with me on the. I'm not the most technologically savvy individual, kind of a boomer, if you will. But this is the shot number 2, and you can see, I believe that's Agent Mike Parsons standing there with the gun, and that's a Colt Python 357 Magnum that he's using to simulate Buford's weapon. Now, another thing I'm going to point out is notice that he's standing somewhat of a distance away from the sponge, right? And remember, their theory is that he took the 357, put it inside his mouth, up against his cheek, and pulled the trigger. So that begs the question, why are you standing back at a distance when you're shooting the sponge? Shouldn't you have the barrel of the gun pressed up against the sponge if that's your theory? So again, their own testing doesn't make sense. If we were talking about Buford here, he would be accused of being a liar. He would be accused. Well, why aren't they held to the same standard as Buford? Well, we'll go ahead and play the clip.
Fire in the hole, fire in the hole. That one ain't gonna work out.
It's string, didn't we?
Yeah.
Sorry. That's all right.
All right. So that was test number 2. And again, like I said, they're not even using the right parameters. They didn't have the measurement of the correct vehicle.
Fire in the hole.
And so I'll go ahead and play the last clip on that, just to close it out here. And here we go. Last test.
Fire in the hole, fire in the hole, fire in the hole.
Oh, and let me back that up. Now, they don't explain this in the report because I read it. Now, if you notice, that sponge, the first 2 tests they basically cut a sponge in half, and they used a smaller sponge. But then for some reason on this last test, they used the full sponge. I mean, I don't know what that means. They don't explain it. They don't give a reason for it. But I'm just letting you know that's what you're seeing there. But we'll go ahead and roll the clip.
Fire in the hole, fire in the hole, fire in the hole.
Aha, look at her. You got some Max better?
Yeah, so basically they're pleased with this third test, and they feel like that proved how these the blood pattern that ended up on the hood. They feel like they've done, they've recreated it. But I'll play it out here.
Yes. Yeah. That spun swung around though. So
That may have been it, yeah.
Yeah. But that's a lot more consistent with.
And you probably started to hear Agent Parsons say that's more consistent with, and I'm assuming he was saying with what's on the hood. But yeah, that's the 3 tests that they did, and we highlighted the problems with what they did there, because number 1, they didn't even measure the right vehicle. They measured a 1966 Plymouth Fury 3 instead of a 1967 Plymouth Fury 1. They've got the gun Well, and then another thing is they're using sponges instead of the gel dummies. If for those of you that have read the report, you know that in the other recreations they actually used the gel dummies. Here they use bloody sponges, and they're shooting from a distance from the sponge instead of right up against it. Which, remember, their theory is that he's got the gun pressed up against his cheek and going out like that, but they're shooting from a distance. And then the height measurements, at the 48 inches, which would make 6'6". But again, when you measure somebody that's, that 6'6" mark is at the top of their head, so it should have been down lower. So they didn't do that. And again, it goes against their own expert who said who claims that it was Pauline's blood, not Buford's. So why are they going against their own expert? I don't know. All right, so that is that, and we're going to move on to the report from Agent Latham I believe, from the Kansas City Bureau. And let's see if I can pull this up here. Okay, I think I got the right one. All right, so let me go ahead and see if I can share my screen here. And share. All right. And let's see if I can put myself down lower here. All right. So now this is the report from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation Forensic Laboratory. And it's a blood stain pattern analysis report put together by Special Agent Corey D. Latham of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. Let me see if I can zoom this in a little bit more. Well, okay. All right. Case information, and they're going to give you a synopsis of what happened with the event. August 12th, 1967. Sheriff Buford Pusser was reportedly summoned by an unknown man who placed the call directly to the sheriff's residence. Sheriff Pusser's wife, Pauline, accompanied him, and they get to the location, slowed across the bridge, vehicle pulls up and fires. And so what you're going to get, as we scroll down, this tells you what they used, what they were given to make this assessment. And they were given black and white crime scene photos, 23 of them. They got the medical examiner report, 2 pages. They got the Tennessee Department of Safety September 3rd, 1967 memorandum from Agent Warren Jones. And then they've got 4 pages of Sheriff Buford Pusser's statement to Warren Jones. They've got medical examiner notes. They've got the McNairy County Chief Deputy Jim Moffitt statement. And that's the one where he's talking to Agent Blackwell in 1976. And there's a TBI firearms report, but that was not examined. So they didn't use that. All right. And this right here is just going to give you some basics about bloodstain pattern analysis, and gives you a whole bunch of definitions. And I'll just kind of scroll through that. All right, now we're getting into the good stuff here. So, limitations and assumptions. When compiling this report, I've made the following assumptions. All of the reddish brown stains depicted in the submitted photographs, which have the appearance and context consistent with blood, is in fact blood, and will be referred to as such for the purposes of this report. That the blood stains depicted in the photographs of the crime scene represent all the significant blood stains associated with the event. All of the blood stains observed and commented upon were deposited essentially contemporaneous to the event surrounding the death of or injuries to Pauline Pusser and Sheriff Buford Pusser, that all of the observed blood stains and bloodstain patterns originated from Sheriff Buford Pusser or Pauline Pusser. When compiling this report, I am faced with the following limitations. And we'll go ahead and highlight this. Number one, I did not attend the crime scene. Number two, observations and conclusions are based on the photographic evidence alone, just pictures. Number three, it is not possible nor practical to describe every blood stain that may have been observed or noted during the investigation of a bloodshed event. And lastly, the available crime scene photographs and related documentation were limited in quantity and quality to include documentation of the crime scenes on the road. So, bad photographs and not enough of them. The observations and opinions concerning the bloodstain pattern analysis are derived from the examination of the crime scene photographs, the autopsy report of Pauline Pusser, and the statements made by TBI Agent Warren Jones, Chief Deputy Jim Moffitt, and Sheriff Buford Pusser. Okay, so now we're going to get into the analysis, observation, and examinations. Then this is where he's going to talk about the blood stains on the hood and the windshield, right? And this is the most important. This really is the linchpin of the whole thing right here, because the whole thing around the blood stain or the blood pattern analysis is the blood stains on the hood and the windshield. And if you can prove that that blood was Pauline's blood, well, then that shoots a hole in Buford's theory, and it must mean that he was lying, must mean that he's guilty. But remember, the blood stains on the hood and on the windshield, those were tested by the FBI laboratory back in the 60s. Now, they didn't have DNA testing back then, but they did have they had type testing. And so if they had two people and each one had different blood types, then they could run a test and tell you which, if there was two different types, if it was all one type or what have you, and they could assign, that way you could figure out whose blood it was. That's pretty much as far as you could go with it. But remember, the FBI tested it and that it was inconclusive. So what does that mean? Well, that means that anybody that's out there today making the claim that they 100% know that the blood on the hood was Pauline's or Buford's, is they don't know what they're talking about. They can't make that claim, So anybody that's saying that it's Pauline's blood and she got shot outside, it's ludicrous. It's ludicrous. Can't be proven. But anyway, let's get back to the report. So right up here, now what they're going to be talking about right here is the blood that was on the hood and the windshield. So right at the top, multiple stains of varying size and shape were observed on the passenger side hood of Sheriff Pusser's vehicle. It was reported that additional stains were present on the windshield adjacent to where the stains were deposited on the hood. But those were not visible to this examiner in the provided photo. So right off the bat, he can't tell you anything about any blood that may or may not have been on that windshield. So that's out right off the bat. Windshield, blood on the windshield. He couldn't find it in the photographs. And this is the expert. This is their expert. Collectively, the stains in this area were identified as A. There are a number of near circular stains in that area. Regarding the elliptical stains, the majority within that pattern orient in a manner in which the long axis of the stains is generally aligned with the long axis of the vehicle, indicating they were deposited by someone in front of the vehicle. So, you've got the circular pattern, and sometimes there's a tail, and usually the tail can depict what direction that the blood came from. And I guess in this instance, they're saying that it must have came from somebody in front of the vehicle. Because of the limitations of not being present at the scene and not having close-up photographs of the stains in this region, potential pattern types for this observed stains include expiration pattern, projected pattern, impact pattern, forward spatter, cast off pattern, and drip stains. Well, let's go look at some of these definitions. So we go back up to where the definitions were, and I highlighted the ones that he talked about there. Cast off pattern, a bloodstain pattern resulting from blood drops released from an object due to its motion. Okay, so, a lot of times we might think about that if somebody uses a knife and they stab somebody in a downward motion, and when they come back up, there's going to be blood on the knife and it's going to be slung somewhere, or maybe they hit somebody with a crowbar or a pipe or some sort of object and it makes contact and then the blood gets cast off, or maybe they had the blood on their hand and they're flailing about and it's cast off. It's pretty simple, and that would align. And remember, that would align with what. And I've got the printout, handy dandy printout of what Buford told Warren Jones. I'm old school. I still like a good printout, and I can flip to the page. And Warren Jones states, it is noted that the FBI laboratory advised that the group blood testing on dried blood on the hood and outside of the windshield and on the rear bumper were inconclusive. In talking with Sheriff Buford Pusser, he advised that after he had been shot, he was bleeding profusely and that he stated he walked around his car while holding on to it. There is a good possibility that the blood on the hood and outside of the windshield and on the rear bumper is his blood. So that aligns. So far, their expert is proving Buford right. Then we've got a drip stain, blood stain resulting from a falling drop that formed due to gravity. Well, if he's walking around the vehicle and he's holding on to the vehicle and maybe he stops for a moment or whatever, it's not inconceivable that blood would drip from him to the hood. And remember, he wouldn't just have his blood on him, he'd have Pauline's blood. Because he was in the car, she gets shot, she's up against him, he's holding on to her. There's no way he would have had her blood on him. So far, again, their expert has proven Buford right. Expiration pattern, a blood stain pattern resulting from blood forced by airflow out of the nose, mouth, or a wound. Well, again, Buford shot in the mouth. He's probably exhaling and stuff as he's coming around the car. So not inconceivable. So far, it's tracking. A blood stain impact pattern, blood stain pattern resulting from an object striking liquid blood. Now this is where it might align with their theory of her being shot in front of the vehicle, possibly. But remember, he can't conclusively say it was just an impact pattern. He's saying it could have been all these others. Projected pattern, a blood stain pattern resulting from the ejection of blood under hydraulic pressure, typically from a breach in the circulatory system. Well, that's another possibility, and I guess that might align with the TBI's theory of either him getting shot or her getting shot in front of the vehicle. It's a possibility. But back to what he's talking about, his observation and examination notes here. He says, because of the limitations of not being present at the scene and not having close-up photographs of the stains in this region, uh, potential pattern types for the observed stains include, and so he includes all of it. So really, it's very inconclusive. So it doesn't prove or disprove Buford's statement. So they're kind of out of luck there. And you got the picture of, I believe that's Agent Sloan looking at the vehicle. You can see those blood stains. Okay, and then moving on. At least 13 elliptically shaped stains were observed on the exterior side of the driver front and rear doors. Directionality of each stain was downward. These stains were identified as pattern B. Stains vary in size. Possible pattern types include projected pattern, expiration pattern, cast-off pattern, and drip stains. Well, once again, he's pretty much checking the box on anything under the sun, but he's limited. 2 additional stains were present within that area of the vehicle. Outlined in red, a somewhat rectangular stain appearing to be light color was observed on the rear driver door within a foot or less of the driver front handle. A second similar appearing stain was observed on the rear driver door window, a foot less above the driver front door handle. Those patterns were both identified as C, and they are consistent with being the result of a swipe or transfer pattern. Well, we know that Buford was walking around the car, and so again, none of this goes counter. So far, they haven't presented anything that refutes Buford's testimony. And then we're going to go on to this side here. Multiple stains varying in size were observed on the exterior side of the front passenger door immediately below the window, which was either rolled down or shot out. Additional stains, but less in number, were present on the rear passenger door as well. Collectively, the stains in this region were identified as pattern D. Several stains were well formed and elliptically shaped. Others had an altered appearance with less defined margins and are lighter in color. Some larger stains in this area had associated flow. Some of the flow was downward and consistent with being only gravity affected. Other flow initially started downward but then changed direction toward the rear of the vehicle. Some of the flows that changed direction actually flowed upward. While it's possible there could be some stains within this region that are the result of other patterns, cast off, expiration, drip stains, overall it's most consistent with a projected pattern. And remember, let's see, projected pattern, let's go back up. A bloodstain pattern resulting from the ejection of blood under hydraulic pressure, typically from a breach in the circulatory system. Well, that means that the person was alive when they got shot, and that's what caused the blood flow. Hydraulic pressure. The heart's pumping, the blood's in the system, So couldn't have been dead. I mean, he's saying that's what it's most consistent with. And there you see the picture of what he's talking about. And then obviously some of this was affected by wind, because we do know that Buford was driving the car after all of this. So far everything is tracking with Buford's version of events. The interior side of the front passenger door was heavily bloodstained. Large stains with disrupted margins overlapped each other near the top of the door panel directly below the window. The blood in this area was identified as pattern E and is consistent with a projected pattern. Flow was observed from the projected patterns downward to the bottom of the door. The blood in this area is consistent with Pauline Pusser being in a close proximity to the door and actively bleeding, meaning she wasn't shot outside the vehicle and placed in the vehicle. Because if she was shot outside the vehicle, by the time she's placed in the vehicle, she would have been dead. She would have been dead already. So far, everything's tracking. Blood accumulated at the threshold of the front passenger door. This pool of blood was identified as pattern F and is consistent with the projected patterns and flow on the interior front passenger door. A projected pattern was also observed on the passenger side of the upper passenger seat back outlined in red. This pattern was identified as G and also supports that Pauline Pusser was actively bleeding in the area near the door. Actively bleeding. Again, nothing's they're not refuting what Buford was saying in this. Moving on. Blood stains were observed on the front seat cushion and seat back. The majority of the stains were on the seat back on the passenger side. The stains in this area varied in shape and size. None were observed on the driver's seat cushion. Stains depicted by red arrows in the image below were collectively identified as pattern H. These stains could be part of a projected pattern and an expirated pattern, a cast-off pattern, drip stains, or a combination thereof. And you can see these are the arrows he's talking about. Those stains were they could be projected, part of a projected pattern, and expirated pattern, a cast-off pattern, drip stains, or a combination thereof. Large areas of staining were observed on the seat back and seat cushion of the front seat, depicted in the image below with yellow arrows. These are collectively identified as pattern I and are saturated stains. Some are present on the passenger side, but the more heavily concentrated saturation stains are near the middle and also on the driver's seat cushion and seat back. The area where the seat back and seat cushion meet on the driver's side was very heavily saturated. Now, we know from reports of witnesses at the crime scene that Pauline was still in that front seat and was kind of laid over towards the driver's area or the driver's seat. And so that kind of makes sense that there would be a lot of saturation there. Moving on, blood was observed on the metal hinge mechanism and side of the seat at the lower driver's side of the front driver's seat, depicted on the image below with red arrows. This area is next to and below the area of heavy saturation in the seat at the driver's side. It was identified as pattern J, classified below. Area heavy saturation. Okay, and classified as flow. So again, they've got the seat laid over like that, to take pictures, but we know that her body was laying in that direction, and so it just makes sense that you'd have blood flow there. So again, I don't see anything that's refuting Buford's version of events. Maybe you guys let me know in the comments. I'm sure the anti-Pusser folks will let me know in the comments where I'm wrong, but I think you guys are going to have a hard time with that. Moving on, near circular and elliptically shaped stains of varying size were observed on the rear passenger side seat cushion, white box on the seat cushion, and on the interior side of the rear passenger door panel. The spatter stains in this area were collectively identified as pattern K and are not classified beyond spatter due to the fact that they could be the result of a number of patterns or combination thereof. So you're not really getting anything conclusive here. He's not ruling anything out one way or the other. But you can see, it kind of makes sense to me, though, that you would have this if someone is, someone got shot in the head, and, if that window gets blown out, there's air blowing, you might end up with that. Makes sense to me. You guys let me know where I'm wrong. Though, looking at this picture, it kind of makes me wonder what, uh, if there was ever a vehicle inventory done. I mean, I know they impounded the vehicle, but they had it stored over at the Chevrolet dealership. I don't know. I'd be curious to know like what's in this box. I mean, that looks like a flashlight. Looks like that might be Buford's jacket. But anyway, that's just kind of if anybody has any information on that, please let me know. And then moving on, a dense concentration of stains was observed on the upper portion of the passenger side rear seat back. Additionally, it appears the pattern continues onto the rear window glass directly above the seat area. The blood in this area is collectively identified as pattern L. The stains on the glass appear altered and several are irregular in shape. These spatter stains could be the result of multiple mechanisms. Flow is observed at the side of the spatter nearest the midline of the vehicle, extending toward the driver's side. The blood flow patterns extend from the heavily concentrated area of staining laterally towards the center of the seat and then traveling slightly downward but nearly parallel to the ground. The flow patterns observed on the upper back seat cover are suggestive of being acted upon by airflow. Open, broken out front and rear passenger windows, pushing the deposited bloodstains parallel to the ground at one point. Two of the flow patterns exhibit a downward change in direction. Again, how is that refuting Buford's story? I think it all tracks. Summary of reports. And okay, so the medical examiner report issued December 15th, 67 indicated Pauline Pusser was shot in the head twice. The first bullet grazed left side of her skull, struck her in an anterior to posterior direction. Second shot struck essentially the same place over the left eye and created a U-shaped dissection of the skull and exited the skull at the base of the brain. Pauline had blood in her mouth, nose, ears. Manner of death was ruled homicide. And, of course, that's Dr. Harry Peeler, who was the medical examiner at the time. That was coming from his report. Tennessee Department of Safety, September 3rd, 1967 memorandum. Agent Warren Jones discussed that several drops of blood were collected from the exterior of the vehicle, but the FBI was unable to determine the blood type. He also indicated visiting Sheriff Pusser the prior week and receiving the following information from the sheriff. He was shot in the chin and bleeding profusely and then walked around the vehicle. And we talked about that already. Statement by Sheriff Buford Pusser. Sheriff Pusser was on patrol the night of August 11, 1967. And then this is just a summary of what we already know. I'm not going to read over that too much. But he's just basically saying that that's what he read over all this as he did his analysis, is what he's letting us know. And then we're going to get to opinions. Okay, opinions. The blood stains observed on the hood of the vehicle were deposited by an individual who was outside, not inside the vehicle. Makes sense. Elliptical stains align with the long axis of the vehicle. These stains do not align with having originated from either the driver or passenger windows. Again, makes sense. The distribution of these stains is far too great to have been created from within the vehicle and exiting through the bullet hole present in the lower passenger corner of the windshield. Because remember, there's that bullet hole in the windshield on the passenger's, lower passenger side. He's just basically saying that he doesn't think that the blood came from within the vehicle out through that hole and then ended up on the hood. He's saying it had to be from someone who was outside the vehicle, which we know from what Buford told Warren Jones. He was outside the vehicle. He was bleeding. He had her blood, and he's holding on to the vehicle, walking around the vehicle. Altered flow from the projected blood stains identified as pattern D is consistent with the vehicle being stationary or moving slowly at the time they were deposited, but then accelerated prior to the stains becoming fixed or dry. Stains are in close proximity to the projected patterns observed on the interior front passenger side door. The flow of several stains is altered approximately 9 degrees from downward with gravity to moving toward the rear of the car, nearly parallel with the ground. Pauline Pusser was positioned next to her or against the interior side of the front passenger door after being injured. Seat cushion on the passenger side is relatively void of significant amounts of spatter or large volumes of projected blood, consistent with Mrs. Pusser sitting in that seat while actively bleeding toward the passenger side door of the window. Again, actively bleeding. Presence of projected blood stains inside and outside the passenger door are originating from a height above the lower margin of the window. Accumulation of pool blood at the door threshold, presence of altered stains. And this is all just, we just went over that. This is just kind of a summary. Or he's just giving his opinion after his summary there. Pauline Pusser laid on the driver's seat at some point during the incident during the incident for a sufficient amount of time to create saturation, stains, and flow. So, and I just talked about that. So none of this refutes his story. And then this is just a little background of Corey Latham, special agent in charge, Westfield Investigations Division, team commander, crime scene response team. Graduated from Kansas State University, 1994, bachelor of science degree, major life science, experience, special agent in charge, November 2, 2017 to present day. And you can see all his organizations that he belongs to, professional certifications, summary of training experience. So just to sum all that up, the guy is definitely highly qualified. He knows what he's talking about. So, and then there's a little bit further synopsis of his experience and everything. But I just went through, we just looked at all the blood stain pattern analysis. We looked at the videos, and I'll go ahead and stop sharing. But we looked at the videos again. I showed you the faults with that and why I don't think it makes any sense. And they didn't really, in my opinion, they didn't prove anything. Because here's the bottom line. If you're not going to do things right, if you're not going to do, they claim that they use the scientific method, but I don't see how that's even possible when you don't use the right variables. You don't use the same materials. You're measuring vehicles that aren't the vehicle instead of, taking measurements from a 66 Plymouth Fury 3 instead of a 67 Plymouth Fury 1. It doesn't make any sense. You're using the sponge instead of the gel dummies. You don't have the gun pressed up against the sponge like you claim that Buford did. So none of it makes any sense. And then we just went through Corey Latham's report, and it does not refute anything that Buford said. Now, he does leave some wiggle room where the other side, could make some claims, but it's not conclusive. It's definitely not the smoking gun or anything that anybody's claimed. And so, and it's often talked about from Mike Elam. He's always clamoring about, show me proof. Where's your evidence? Where's your proof? Blah, blah, blah. Well, I just showed you. I'm using Corey Latham's own report as my evidence that, Buford's story is the most likely of what happened, and that their story doesn't make sense. And they're going against their own expert anyway. Why are you trying to prove something that goes against your own expert? The only expert, mind you, that suggested that Pauline was shot outside the vehicle and placed in the vehicle. And then you go ahead and do tests to try to refute that. What sense does that make? What sense does that make at all? So there you go, folks. I just spent some good amount of time, a whole hour dedicated to the forensics. And I know, like I said, folks have hit me up in the comments and, well, you're not talking about the forensics. What about the forensics? And, well, you're only nitpicking the little bits and pieces, and that's all irrelevant anyway. Who cares about the hearsay? Who cares about made up stories? It's all about the forensics. Well, folks, I just spent a whole hour, and I'm not even, that's just a small part of it. So this is just part one. We're going to continue on. I'm going to continue on and come back at you with the next video. And we're going to delve into some more of this. We've got plenty of stuff to talk about. But I think an hour is more than plenty for this video. I usually don't like to do these hour-long videos. I try to go shorter. But it's your turn, folks. You let me know in the comments what you think about this, where I'm wrong. But if you're coming in the comments, here's my request. If you're going to come in the comments and criticize what I'm doing or what I'm saying, can you make it relevant to the video that I just showed you? Try not to divert off into some other thing. Not that I'm afraid to talk about those things, but you guys are the ones that are always hammering about, well, let's talk about the real evidence. Well, here we are. So now give me your thoughts. You guys can let me know how wrong I am or how right I am, whatever. But with that, folks, I'm going to wrap it up and get up out of here. Quit wasting your time. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's healthy. Hope your week is going well. And 2026 has been kind to you so far. But that's going to do it, folks. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys on the next video. Take care, everybody.